This morning we continue our sermon series in which we're looking at the generous life. Last week we looked at stewardship, and this week we look at financial wisdom. When it comes to financial matters, I learned pretty much at the feet of my parents as to how to handle finances. I learned how to be wise with my finances from my mother. I learned, from my father, I learned how to spend well. That's what I can say for how my father taught me about financial wisdom. I know that some of their wisdom came from Scripture, and today we're beginning with two guiding words of Scripture for us as we look at this topic of financial wisdom. But they're not the only Scriptures that I'll refer to today. But in Scripture, it's almost alarming how much Jesus talks about money. You would think that this was the main topic for the Christian faith as much as Jesus talks about money. He discussed the topic of money more than he spoke about faith and prayer combined. Faith and prayer, which you would think would be a go-to kind of topic for Jesus to speak on, he spoke of less than he spoke of money. Jesus typically taught in stories, parables. 11 of his 40 parables that are in our Gospels, 11 of them have to deal with money matters. Financial wisdom is found from the teachings of Jesus and throughout Scripture. And here are two readings of Scripture that guide us this morning. One from Proverbs chapter 11, verses 24 and 25. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives water will get water. And this from the teaching of Paul, his first letter to Timothy, chapter 6, verse 17. As for those who in the present age are rich, command them not to be haughty, or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but rather on God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Thanks be to God for this reading of Holy Scripture. These verses from the Bible reveal that it's always been a timely matter to address financial concerns for the people of God. It's an age-old topic that is as old as our scriptures, and it's also a current topic. It's still a part of our lives as followers of Christ to consider how to use our finances wisely. In fact, this past week in the Courier, on the Tuesday edition, I was surprised to see that there was an article on financial anxiety that is a common thing for many folks. And so they were giving some guidance. And the title of the article is Conquer Your Money Anxiety. It seems to me like possibly I see this kind of thing weekly in the Courier. There's some advice or some conversation about finances. But the article went on to comment on student loan stress, on recession anxiety, which I didn't have until I read the article. I didn't know that we were supposed to have recession anxiety, that we could be moving towards a recession. I didn't know folks were feeling that. Credit card debt was addressed in this brief article, and then also retirement blues. All of them anxiety for us around finances. Finances can be an anxious thing for us to consider. As individuals, it can be something that kind of captures our thinking and we're worried about. Marriages sometimes can rise and fall based on where they're at financially and whether or not they've got those things in order. It can be an anxious thing to consider our finances. How do we do that with wisdom in the Christian faith? How do we handle our financial resources? How do we become stewards of what we've been given? Fact is, we tend to add to the anxiety more than we subtract from it. That is, we kind of compound the problem with some of our practices or lack of practices. We have ways of wasting money. There are many ways to waste money, but I want to begin by just sharing at least two primary ways that yours truly has wasted money over time. I've learned these as I said, for my father, how to waste money. I observed him in action, how this would sometimes play out. It's not necessary to eliminate these two things that I'm about to suggest, but we should think more carefully about how we spend our money if we're striving to be financially wise with our finances. The first money waster is impulse buying. We buy by impulse, or at least I do. I tend to buy by impulse. That's sometimes how I use my money. It seems that more financially secure we become, the less we worry about spending it here and there, and it kind of adds up over time when you just spend a little bit here and a little bit there, or without really thinking. It's just like money seems to flow through our fingers. It did with my father. He came home with a Mustang. You know, a father of three, and he drove home a Mustang one day. And he was studying to become a pastor at the time. He was in seminary. I was 4 years old. It was a nice ride. I wish we had that Mustang again. But that's the kind of thing my father would do. I realize that it happens in me as well. Many of us struggle with compulsive shopping. So this past Tuesday, I was a bachelor for the evening. Ethan had a lesson for his French horn, and that's down near Cedar Rapids, which is where my mother-in-law lives. So Karen was going to eat out with her mother while he was having that French horn lesson. And so I was a bachelor, and I had some time on my hands because there was no finance committee meeting. There was no committee meetings at all that Tuesday night. It was a strange Tuesday night. So I had some time on my hands, and my alarm clock kind of gave up the ghost about 3 weeks ago. And for some reason, I think I need to be able to see what time it is in the middle of the night when I wake up in the middle of the night. So I had this is what I needed to do. I needed to get an alarm clock. I thought probably the closest place may be Kohl's. Maybe I can buy an alarm clock at Kohl's. Well, where I would think there would be an alarm clock went right by the men's department. See this shirt? I got this shirt, and this is a new belt. This is a reversible. You know, this will be handy because it's got a black side and a brown side. That's nothing to mess with. I bought the belt as well. I was looking for an alarm clock, remember? So I'm seeing that, and then I realized, I should get a new tie. I should get a tie that I don't have, one that looks completely different from the other. And it's a nice tie, but when you get to comparing it to the rest of the tie, I got one that's pretty similar. So this was not. I am an impulse buyer when it comes. It's not a good thing. I should not be left alone. That's what I've learned. I've learned that if I'm left alone in a shopping department, it could all go badly. I've learned some things over time about impulse shopping and what not to do. I don't necessarily practice them, and you probably know these things too. What'll get you to be able to overcome impulse buying? Never go to the grocery store shopping when you're hungry. Right? That's a good way to avoid impulse buying at the grocery store. Don't go when you're famished and you're hungry. Shop for what you need only. Make a list and stick to it. Buy what you need and get out of the store. Like, let's say you're looking for an alarm clock. Buy the alarm clock. By the way, don't go to Kohl's for an alarm clock this time of year. They told me they only sell them around back to school time. I don't know. That's the only time you need an alarm clock. I had to go to Target. I had to continue this whole thing. I finally got an alarm clock, but it wasn't pretty. Wait 24 hours before purchasing an impulse buy. That's a suggestion that is given to us as well. I know all these things. I still waste money by impulse shopping. I did it just this week. And it wasn't even because I was trying to make an illustration for this sermon. It just happened that way, and I realized I needed to share with you that your pastor struggles with some of this financial wisdom as well. The second money waster is eating out. Now, the thing here isn't eating out in and of itself. It's the frequency in which we eat out. That's where it gets to be a money waster, is the frequency. The average American eats out on average 4 times a week. So consider that. If that's the average, I don't know where you find yourself, if you're in the 4-time crowd or more, but if you gave up a couple of those opportunities during the week, how could you perhaps use that money in a different way? How would you perhaps create a bit of of a margin there for you to be able to use that money in a different way or a generous way, in a way of giving to the work of the church or some other way by not eating out. We tend to waste money by eating out too frequently. Our money is entrusted to us. As we learned last week, we are managers of our money. We are stewards of what has been given to us. It's all a gift, and all of it is something we should consider how we utilize what God has given us. How can we practice good financial habits and live within our means? There's an index card in your bulletin this morning. We'd like to get some feedback from you about just that type of a question. How do we practice good financial habits? The one question we'd consider is, how do you reduce your debt in order to be able to be more generous in giving to the work of God? If you're experiencing debt issues, how can you reduce your debt to be able to do that? How do you create the margin to be able to perhaps be more generous as givers to the work of God in the world? I know this doesn't happen very often, but we're going to give back a little bit this morning. The offering plate that went by is going to now come and be passed out, and we're going to give you something. We call it a reverse offering. So this reverse offering is something called the 6 principles, financial principles for a generous for a generous life. And so on this little wooden card that Heath Wilkin actually made for us. I appreciate that, Heath. You'll note that it's the size of a credit card, but too thick. You will not be able to use this as a credit card at Kohl's or wherever you're eating later today. But it is credit card side to remind us of the key financial principles. So we'll have the ushers go ahead and pass that out, and just take one per family. I think there's probably enough for one per family to be able to follow along as we look at these teachings, these principles of the generous life. So the first principle in this is to following a financial planning principles that these are actually come from an organization, Ramsey, Dave Ramsey. You hear him on the radio, Financial Peace University. These ideas come from that and have some biblical principles. We'll show you those biblical principles, but you'll also see what the 6 principles are. The first is pay what you're going to give to the work of God. Pay that first. Set that aside first. Have that be the first fruits of what you give to the work of God. So put that first. Put God first in your living and in your giving, and give your tithe or your offering on the top of your paycheck. Set it aside, budget for it, expect that to already be a part of what you're going to be about. The second thing is to create a budget and track your expenses. Creating a budget is simply developing a plan that tells you where your money is going to do and what it's going to do for you. So managing your money is a great way to live financially wise and a generous life. Tracking your expenses with a budget is like getting on the scales in the morning. It allows you to see how you're doing and motivates you to be more careful with your expenses. So a suggestion that's found in our GPS bulletin insert is a basic budget worksheet. You'll see the percentages there at what is a good, healthy, suggested percentage for things like housing and transportation, food and savings and utilities, and then kind of decide what is your actual expense and how are you going to move it towards being more in line with what would be a healthy perspective and a financially wise way to budget for ourselves. The third thing is to simplify your lifestyle. Live below your means, as they say. Simplifying your lifestyle requires a practice of self-control. Self-control comes down to making a choice between satisfying an impulse, an instant gratification, and choosing not to act upon the opportunity for instant gratification for some higher cause, for a greater gratification. Not instant gratification, but a greater gratification that helps guide the world in a new way. Self-control is about foregoing an impulse buy, perhaps, like your pastor struggles with. 3 questions that we can ask ourselves. What's the long-term consequence of this action, my potential purchase that I'm going to be making? What's the long-term consequence? Is there a higher good, a better outcome if I use this resource of money or time, for that matter, or our talents and energy in another way? Will this action honor God? All of that helps us with simplifying our lifestyle to live below our means. Are there major changes that would allow you to simplify your life? Are you living a lifestyle that you can afford? Are you driving a car that you're paying too much for, or you're living in a housing situation that is pushing you beyond your means? Ben Franklin put it this way on this topic, and I think he had it right when he said, contentment comes, and contentment makes poor men rich, but discontentment makes rich men poor. It's about being content with what we have, simplifying our lives. I'd rather you and I be poor but have contentment than those who have everything and don't realize what we have. What is really important in your life is what simplifying our lifestyle expects us to consider. The 4th principle of these 6 is to establish an emergency fund. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing. To establish an emergency fund is not to establish a savings account. This is a way of savings for a particular thing. An emergency fund is separate. It may be in your checking account, but it's a separate kind of accounting that you do for yourself and your family. It's a long-term thing, but it's not long-term savings. It's what Dave Ramsey recommends to begin with as $1,000, to have an emergency fund of at least $1,000 if you don't have one now, and building towards having 3 months worth of income in that emergency fund. To have that emergency fund really frees you up kind of mentally with being able to deal with a financial crisis. You know, the boiler goes out, the dishwasher, the laundry clothes washer goes out. You've got that emergency fund that's already there, and it can handle that unexpected expense. When you have that kind of thing there, then your credit cards become less important as well. You don't need to use those in the ways that get us into trouble. So establish an emergency fund. The 5th thing is to pay off your credit cards. Use your cash, your debit cards for purchases, and use credit wisely. So paying off your credit cards as they come in each month is just a healthy and wise principle to expect to work towards if it's already not something that you're doing. Using your credit card only in the way of it being basically a pass-through. It's just like cash. It's easier to carry, and that's the way that you perhaps would use a credit card, but not as a way of building up debt. Now, if you do have credit card debt, and the average American has like $16,000 on credit cards, on various credit cards, that's the average. So consider where you're at in the average. You may just make yourself feel better because you were so far below that. But that's the average. For many Americans, we have $16,000 in debt. Ramsey says that the way to get out of that credit card bind, that debt, is to start paying off the smallest ones first, and then create a snowball effect of kind of paying those off until you're no longer dealing with that credit card debt. If that's hard for you, possibly the best place to start is just to cut up the credit card sometime this afternoon. If you're having trouble with the debt that keeps rising on your credit cards, cut up those credit cards and begin to figure out ways to live within our means. Listen to what financial planner Kim Mullaney has to say about financial wisdom in this little video clip.
People who have financial wisdom seem to know instinctively to save their money, to not buy a used car, for example, as opposed to a new car, to make do sometimes with some of the old before rushing out to buy the latest and greatest. And we live in a society where debt is marketed to us so beautifully and so aggressively that we've come to think it's an okay thing. But you go back to biblical principles, and the borrower really is slave to the lender.
I like how she puts that it's been marketed to us so well that we think debt is actually something we should have. And the biblical principles are that debt is really just not a good situation to be in the first place. It's not a wise way to use our financial resources. The sixth thing is to practice long-range savings and investing habits. This is just wise money management principle in this regard. That means that having some savings for some wants and goals is a good thing to do. You know, if you have a goal of wanting to travel to some place that you've never been as a family, that's a worthy goal, and you start to save for it. You don't figure out how to go into debt for it, but you save for that. Retirement savings is not something that we should feel badly about, that we've got retirement savings. This is a way that we're going to be able to manage our funds later in life. And that emergency savings is also a part of things, but that's a separate thing altogether from the other two types of savings that we will do for ourselves. Finally, let me just ask you a question that comes from the GPS guide that's in our bulletin insert this morning that continues to further look at this topic of financial wisdom. Within it, there's a Pastor Kelly Sensnig that asks the question, which tent will you live in? Will you live in discontent or contentment? Are we going to live in discontent around our finances, or are we going to kind of overcome that and begin to live within contentment and understand our finances? You and you alone determine which tent will be yours. You choose it in large part by deciding what your life is about, what's most important in life. If you decide that life doesn't consist in the abundance of your possessions, then you'll kind of figure out a way to no longer impulse buy. I mean, you know, I'll be wearing this shirt for a while. That wasn't too bad. But in other ways, I got to figure out ways to not be an impulse buyer. Perhaps it was when I got to the counter and she said that it was going to be $88 and I thought it was going to be just around $50. I should have said, I don't think I should buy any of this because I'm not practicing what I'm going to preach in the future. Choosing contentment means we look to God as our source, giving thanks for what we have. We ask God to give us the right perspective on money and possessions and change our hearts each day. We decide to live simply and not waste, but at least waste less, conserve more, and choose to live the generous life. So be it, and may it be so.